So excited to be here today with all of you. Dan and I are going to be chatting about maximizing ROI with automation, and we're going to share some different perspectives on what we think automation is. So, thank you for joining us today. Going to the next slide, and we'll do quick introductions. So, Dan, could you give a quick introduction for yourself?
Yeah, hello, I'm Dan Gregoire, Principal Technical Solutions Manager for our MX product. I've been with MasterControl since MX was in beta, so about 7 years, and I had a long career in med device and combination product manufacturing and quality assurance prior to MasterControl.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm Brian Curran. I've been with MasterControl since 2002, so very well versed on the QX or QMS software. But when we came out with the manufacturing solution, as Dan said, almost a decade ago now, I just became enamored with that. And so that's been my focus, helping customers and ourselves be successful with manufacturing excellence. So you'll probably hear us talk about MX. That's short for manufacturing excellence. That is our manufacturing product. Let's dive into the topics for today. The first one is shared goals across the industry. That's what we want to share in terms of perspectives, what we see our prospects and customers want from an outcomes perspective. The next one is the strategic return on automation. Almost sounds like a Star Wars title. The keywords there is we have this pattern that we've developed called return on automation. We want to share with you what that is about. Shifting to a digital mindset. We have helped over 200 customers complete 1.5 million batch records with 500 million data captures.
Brian, I think it
And
sounds way better when you say 500 million.
I love that, Dan. Good interjection. So, 500 million data captures. The key there is we see things that others haven't, and we've detected some patterns. And one of those patterns is described in this section. We have to change our mindset, and Dan's going to talk about that. And then, because we have so many of those customers, we're going to share some of the real world results that those customers have experienced. So excited for all of these sections, but the real world results I think you'll enjoy. So, aligning on what matters, what are the shared goals? What are those outcomes that we see most companies want? First and foremost, the most common is reducing release times. And I would say not all customers have that, but the majority do have that as a problem. And specifically, they finish their manufacturing and production and then take an inordinate amount of time to actually get the product shipped. So we'll talk about that in more details with some subsequent slides. The other one, all the customers using paper, clearly that causes lots of problems and errors. So the second focus or outcome that we see customers express is we need to decrease the number of errors. That can be manifested in various goals like increasing the rate first time on your documentation, etc. Third one, improving resource optimization. And we'll dive into more details on that, but specifically, how do I do more with less, or how do I do more with the same number of people? How do I scale up my organization? And the ultimate goal for most entities is how do I increase my production throughput? And we'll have some slides on that as well. So here I'd like to spend just a little bit of time explaining what we see as the common current state across 80% of life science manufacturers who are still using paper to manage their batch records. The pink arrow in the middle is the number one problem. The overall lead time varies and the release time is too long. And because the release time is too long, arguably the lead time, the time required to go from manufacturing to shipping the order is too long. So what we will spend a slide or two on is how do we reduce release time? And what I'm describing here is a stereotypical manufacturing process at a high level. Most companies have a manufacturing process and then a packaging process. whether or not they have a packaging process or you take that into a different industry and you upstream, downstream, etc. On the left-hand side is typically the processes. On the right side is how do we do all of the finalization of those processes, specifically the review and release, and what's often referred to as disposition. Ultimately, the goal is to shrink that pink arrow and reduce your overall lead time, which we can do by reducing the release time. So starting here, we looked across our customer base and analyzed the number of batch records and how many manual entries were in the batch record. The average number of manual entries is 1,100, came out to be 1,100 and some change. But for easy math, I just used 500. And let's take these two processes, and they could be segmented any way you wanted. We're going to say the manufacturing group has 500 manual entries and the packaging group has 500 manual entries. What that really translates into is a review and release process that takes 1,000 entries and has to manually review line by line, page by page, 1,000 entries. I will say this is averages. Recently, how many, Dan, was the number of manual entries? We set a new record recently, I think.
It was just over 15,000.
So 15,000 manual entries. That if that was done in the manufacturing world on the review and release, that means 15,000 manual entries have to be reviewed. So regardless of the actual number, it's very common in that review process during audits, customers routinely hear it's a mess because it's all on paper. And there's a desire often to ship at risk because the release process is so long. So there's a question and there's an evaluation. It's like, no, we're not going to ship at risk because my right first time is so low. Can't trust my documentation, all that good stuff. The interesting thing is 99% of the errors, since the customer's using those 500 manual entries, 1,000 manual entries on paper, 99% of the errors that we find are GDP. And in the bottom right, you'll see the 14-day average. We've seen customers in particular industries like biologics that tends to be more measured in months, not days. But I'll use 14 days as the average time for the review and release process. You notice the gap there. That gap is paused or response. The manufacturing production group usually hands a paper-based batch record to the QA group, and it's so messy and so problematic that the organizational response is before handing it off, we're going to do some cleanup in the manufacturing group, often called disposition. So what that means is somebody in manufacturing or team in manufacturing is also reviewing the 1,000 entries. And the review and release doesn't happen until actually manufacturing goes through it to try to clean up the batch record to make sure that's not so problematic when going to the QA group. That adds another 7 days. So on average, call it 21 days after manufacturing is done before we can actually ship product because the documentation is completed. Why do we want to reduce lead time? Often we get so myopically focused on lead time, and my review time is 21 days, and I need to get it to 20 days and 19 days. Why? Why are the executives pressing on this so much? Number one, in my mind, is increasing throughput. The organization, regardless of what you're producing, can create more batches using the same resources. And that means either the people or the number. Some of our customers think that before using MX, they were tapped out on capacity at a given site. After using MX and increasing throughput, they could actually increase their overall capacity without investing heavily in a new site. Many other reasons: improving working capital to accelerate the revenue recognition. You get to reduce the inventory management and specifically the holding cost. You reduce your back orders, your stock outs. The number one thing I want to make or observe is these are business metrics and business problems that are often visible at the executive level. So yes, we have problems with paper in a paper-based manufacturing world with GDP errors, and we're doing Pareto analysis. Those kinds of things are just the symptoms that are happening at the operation level. The reason it's a real problem that executives will be willing to invest is because it affects the lead time. So, how do we address that? How do we shrink that lead time? We have something called return on automation that addresses this gap that we see in life sciences specifically. When we think of, and when I speak to people about automation, this picture on the left side is what most people think. It's whether you're producing chips that could be semiconductor chips or Doritos, the manufacturing volume is so high that companies have basically automated people out of the process. You don't see any people in that picture. This picture is very high tech, has lots of automation, but notice the people are still there. Within the life sciences group, because the volume is not as great as semiconductor chips or Frito-Lay chips, more often than not, there's many people on the shop floor. And so the automation that we are noticing is possible and needed in life sciences is how do we help people automate some of those tasks? So redefining automation for life sciences, here's one definition. It's a working definition. We can update it. Augment human capacity with machines and digital tools to increase efficiency, reduce cost, and improve quality. The number one thing for me, whether you're automating whatever task you're automating, all those increase efficiency, reduce cost, improve quality, those are always the same. The difference for me is in the life science space, we've got to take a look at how do we automate and augment what the humans are doing, because there's more humans in the manufacturing process for life sciences than typical. When I say automation, here are some of those things that humans are doing that show great potential, that if we can make them happen in an automated fashion, will reduce errors and save time. Top left, date, time, and signature. There's so many humans involved doing the operation, doing the weighing, and then actually we throw more humans at it to do the verification and double checking and triple checking. Top right, calculations. A calculation is never done on its own in a life sciences manufacturing environment. A calculation is done, and then a verifier is doing it. A QA reviewer is doing it, and probably a manufacturing review. So every calculation in a life sciences environment arguably is done 4 times. And then as we go down through the lists, summarizing a table, which is another form of calculations. Projections is copying, transcribing a field from page 2 into page 35. Conditional path, auto-NAing. If you think about most batch records, there's many decisions that we place on the operator to say, if it's this product, do these steps. If it's that product, don't do those steps. Time and date is another form of more calculations. And then barcodes is another example. Rather than transcribing a serial number, you have a barcode and typing it. We could just use barcode technology to automate data entry there. And then we can apply even more. The computer can do more than just make entries better. It can actually do checks and limits and pattern matching to make sure that whatever entry is put into the system, we actually apply some logic to make sure that it's higher quality. This is where most people think when they think automation. They think automating to the shop floor, automating the weigh and dispense, automating any number of systems and integrating the number of systems. As we look at batch records through this process called return on automation, I'll pose it as a question. When you look at batch records, do you see more of these things, or do you see more actual integration points? We see more of the former. Yes, certain things have to be weighed and pulled into the ERP, allocated, etc. But most of the operations in a 100-page batch record are these items. And these are the types of items that we can automate when you move from paper to digital. So the impact on operations, and I'm going to explain in numbers what that impact will be. Return on automation. This is a process where we analyze the paper-based batch records for all of those calculations and other types of automation potential and make an assessment of how many can be automated, how many manual entries can be automated. On average, as we look across all of the batch records, 54% of the manual entries can be eliminated or automated on the average batch record. That's more than half. So if you have 1,000 manual entries in your batch record, 540 manual entries don't have to be entered and don't have to be reviewed. This is the biggest bulk of manual entries. 54% is average. By definition, more than half of the customers we visit have more than 50 evaluate. More than half customers have more than 54%. Most people, when they think about automation, think about integrating with equipment or other systems, ERP, etc. Those do provide incremental value. The 81% is 17% more than 54%. And the reason I love this slide is it highlights the biggest bang for the buck in terms of automating is just digitizing. And then after that, you can get incremental improvement by doing barcode scanning, integrating to an ERP, integrating to another system. What we've seen and looking at the data is each one of those might give you another 7% or another 9%. Barcode gives you 7%, integrating to the ERP gives you 5%, integrating to equipment gives you 10%. The vast majority, the biggest bang for the buck is just digitizing because that gives you 54%.
And Brian, just to kind of put a little bit of polish on the end, just because you get to 81% through all of the automations doesn't mean that the operator is still doing 19 or 20% data transcriptions. A lot of time that balance of the 19% is the operator simply hitting a step complete button or a record time date button, which really kind of brings that almost up to 100%. Again, the ultimate objective is to take the operator completely out of data transcriptions for error proofing and for efficiency.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, now here's the secret sauce, if you will. We took return on automation. We have that concept, but remember the original goal was reducing lead time. How does ROI effectively help customers reduce lead time? This is the same drawings I had originally, where manufacturing had 500 manual entries, packaging had 500 manual entries. If we apply the MX digital implementation plus integrations and barcode, that means 81% of the manual entries would be eliminated or automated, leaving only 19% of those manual entries to be entered. The real value is in reducing the review and release time. That means only 19% of those entries have to be reviewed for release. So if you remember, there's typically within the manufacturing group this dispositioning process. By implementing MX and just going digital, they went from 100 manual entries to be reviewed to 460. And then by implementing the barcode and automating, went down to 190. What we see in practice is this typical 7-day time to clean up the batch record is no longer required. It will typically go to 0 days. In a similar vein, the review and release process went from 1,000 manual entries that the QA group has to review to 460 just by digitizing. And then after it, doing the barcoding and automating to 190 days. In addition to that, We can also, because it's digital and electronic batch record, we can employ a review by exception process. So we're only needing to review the things that went wrong, not the 99% of the things that went right. So in those cases, we're able to reduce the release times by 90% or greater. And that release time goes from 14 days down to hours. As a result, we're able to reduce the release time from 21 days to hours. This is just an example. The way I like to describe it is if your release time is currently weeks, it'll come down to days or hours. If it's months, it'll come down to days or ultimately hours. And whatever your release time is, take 90% of that or greater, and that's what you can expect. You'll be able to reduce your review and release time, which the greatest impact, going back to the beginning of the presentation, overall lead time is reduced because we've reduced the review and release time from 21 days to 1 day. So in the process of doing that, there's also a wrong way to do it and a right way to do it. And if you do it the wrong way, you won't get the reduction in the release time. Dan, can you help us understand the right way to do it?
Yeah, certainly. So shifting to a digital first mindset, it's kind of a topic that I will call thinking digitally. And I could probably do a whole webinar on that. Maybe someday we will, but I'll try to boil it down to the important parts today. So many customers, when we go to an engagement and they're making their, I'll go do air quote, digital transformation, and they're ready with the paper batch record that they have, and they want to replicate it, right? We call that paper on glass. We could go to the next slide. So many customers I see that they want to do the configure for paper on glass. They've got that digital record. They just want to recreate it. To be successful, it doesn't always work out. The customers that I see do that who haven't been able to successfully talk out of it, within 6 to 9 months after go live, they come back and they're asking us for help. They're not seeing the return that they wanted to, or expected rather. The operators are not having a good user experience. If it was inefficient before, it's going to be inefficient afterwards. So we need to get to the digital thinking process. And how do we do that? And one of the easiest and the most important ways is to kind of rethink the why. Before you start your digital transformation, you want to look at each data capture, each verifier, each witness, and ask why. What is the purpose of the data point? Is it for compliance? Is it for quality? Is it for operational tracking? Does it have some other purpose? Is the data still relevant? Manufacturing processes evolve. Some historical data requirements, they may no longer be necessary. Can the data be captured automatically? This is where the digital thinking really elevates and gets into those automations and some of the things that Brian talked about earlier in the deck. Was the data capture because of an audit observation or a CAPA? Important question to ask, but it's also important to think about how you answered it. You certainly, an audit observation, you want to make sure you don't lose that, but a lot of the audit observations and CAPA corrective actions that are in place in a paper system are there because of the limits of the paper system, or the underlying error was caused by deficiencies in a paper system. So again, you have an opportunity not to recreate those digitally. And then always ask yourself who uses the data and for what purpose. To understand who consumes that data will help you understand whether it has true value to continue to capture in the record. Next slide, please. So I'm usually a little more provocative on this one when I'm just having conversations with people, and I'll usually say, you know how many times an auditor has wrecked a perfectly good process? But it's not really the auditors that's doing it. The auditor is rightfully bringing up some deficiency that they found, and it really comes down to sometimes how we just respond to those audit observations. And I say this fully in full transparency, because I've done the same thing myself when I was in industry. We're all busy people. We have day jobs. The audit just adds stress and time that we don't have to give. We get the audit report. Now I have 30 days to get a response in, and my choices are take my best engineers off what their day jobs are and put them on super valuable root cause investigations, or I can just say, like the first line item there, you know what, I'll just have somebody verify it. And if you only do that once, that's fine. But if you're talking about a mature process, your paper record contains all the warts of years or decades worth of audit responses. Um, and it's very helpful when we go to the digital thinking to try to re-examine all of those. Another place I see this, any of our high volume customers or automated, semi-automated manufacturing customers, they all do hourly checks. And it would be nice to think that every single manufacturer on the planet has the exact same process variability because they all do checks every 60 minutes. But the reality is they probably just do checks every hour. So when they find an issue, they can limit how far back they have to go in time to basically do bounding. But whenever I see one with tolerances, I know that there's an audit observation behind that because, again, on a paper record, if I do my 12 o'clock check and I come do my 1 o'clock check and it's 1:07, I'm probably going to write down 1 o'clock because it's my 1 o'clock check. And everybody who worked in manufacturing knows that I just described pencil whipping and it's really a thing. But one day somebody wrote down 65 minutes and the auditor saw it. And then the next week they put in a corrective action that says 1 hour plus or minus 10 minutes. And so when we do the digital thing, I always stress that this is a good time to embed things in your SOPs, like what is the purpose of this check? And it's okay if I miss a check from a break or I'm 15 minutes late. Build those things into your procedures. Safety sections really isn't from an audit, but what I would look at is, regulatory things change over time and OSHA expectations change over time. And customers have built in wonderful safety sections full of personal protective equipment, all sorts of warnings and MSDS sheets. And they're always at the front of a paper theory that, well, everybody should be looking at the front of that record at some point. And the reality is when you go to look at that in a digital environment, typically the operator goes directly to where they're working and bypasses those earlier sections. So we need to just strategically think a little bit differently about how we do safety sections. I wouldn't want to recreate what was on paper. And then the last one was just an example of label reconciliation, where again, on a paper record, you probably have at the beginning of the record or close to the beginning of the record a label reconciliation worksheet, and you've transposed data values from all around the record and put them in one place where it's neat and convenient to just go check it out. Or again, now in a digital environment, I can take a data entry from page 2 and a data entry from page 48 and all the different places at point of use that I've used it and just run a calculation and automatically do that reconciliation. So we're not really bound by the structures that the paper record kind of forced us into. And then next, please. And part of this, the digital environment and digital thinking is really thinking about how to properly assess risk. So it always amazed me that, for those of us who've done process validation in life sciences, you're all familiar with 95, 95, 95, 99, 95, 99, 9, the different things, the different uh, confidence intervals that we do validation at, kind of depending on where your product attribute lives on an FMEA. Yet we will do 95, 95 on a product attribute, but we expect the device history record to be 100% perfect every time. And it's a noble goal, but if you looked at your record with the FMEA mindset, you wouldn't expect it to be perfect 100% of the time, and you would be okay with that. So the first thing I say is obviously approach the record with an FMEA mindset. Okay, yes, I have to capture these values. What's the risk in having this value incorrect? And one thing I turn to all the time, and I use it again as a provocative example, is lot numbers. I encounter so many customers who spend thousands of man hours checking and verifying lot numbers. And I look at them and say, like, hey, the risk of that being incorrect is low. And you can argue with that logic, but just concentrate on the process, right? It doesn't have to be lot numbers. Just think about risk in general. Where do I have other systems that collect that data? Well, for a lot number, you have your ERP system that's going to do two things. It's going to tell you what was in process and available at any given time. So if I do have to do an investigation and I find out that somebody incorrectly went to a lot number, I should be able to recreate that from the ERP. But secondly, if you have an ERP system, someone is executing a transaction, and when you consume that, um, and there is your backup. It amazes me that more people don't have their ERPs set up to flag them when they try to consume an incorrect lot number. But again, don't focus on the lot number, focus on the process and think, where do I have other systems that can be backups for those data? And then where risk is high and backups are limited, push you right back to automation. So if you don't agree with me on the lot number risk, and you say that that risk is high, that's cool. Pull out your barcode scanner and enter that in the record and take that opportunity for transcription away from the operator. Similarly, obviously, if you do weigh and dispense, your weighing and your formulations are super important. Let's look at edge devices for connecting those scales or other integration. Take that data capture away from the operator and do it directly from the equipment. And then the added bonus there is the automated data captures eliminate the requirement for that second operator to come in and verify. So with that, I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Okay, the next section is looking at real world results, taking some of the things we've talked about, ROI, applying risk, etc., and reducing release time. It's what are the customers actually getting as a benefit of going from paper-based batch records to EBR. Here's an example of one of our biologics-oriented customers who reduced the release time. And the way you read the chart, looking at the left-hand side, this is their control chart for their paper BMR. And you can see the average was 120 days of the average time to release, because that's the number of dull days between end of production for them and final sign off. They implemented MX. They implemented a digital system, and you could see the line, this blue line, the mean went down significantly, but it was still high, still somewhere up in the neighborhood of 80 days. And one of the reasons is because they created their batch records similar to the paper-based batch records. And so they had far too many verifications, witnesses, etc. They did not leverage, they did not think digitally the way Dan described. And in fairness, I think when we did our first batch record 7 years ago, we probably did not think digitally the same way, as it's over helping hundreds of customers with thousands of batch records that we've learned these things and able to share with the larger group. So in this instance, Dan went back in, helped them optimize, and you can see the mean went down to around 20 days. And ironically, this was still not the best. They've since improved it further and are down to 2 days.
Which is still a day and a half too long.
Which is still too long.
But they're happy.
But coming from 120 days down to 2 days and trying to get even lower, this is just one of the examples that the customer achieved a 90% improvement. And just think of the lead time improvement that they've been able to give to their company, and all the more flexibility, cost savings, et cetera, but then also flexibility to serve more customers, take on more business, et cetera. Next one. Decreasing the total number of errors. This is from a different customer, and both, I'll say all of these customers have shared this information in public settings at conferences where I've co-presented with them, or at other conferences where they presented themselves. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'm just abstracted or genericized it so that we're leaving out the actual customer names. But this is another one of our customers who, over their lifetime, estimates that MX has helped them avoid over 1.4 million errors. And the reason they're able to make this estimate is that MX has captured 47 million data captures since going from paper to digital. And if we apply a 3% error rate, which is the normal human error studies say that humans make errors 3 to 7% of the time, most of the time because they become distracted and just miss things. But I'll use the lower end of that range. 3% of 47 million is 1.4 million errors. This is the haystack of GDP errors predominantly, whether it's 1.4 million or 140,000. It's going to be a big number in your organization because all of those GDP problems are where everybody is focusing. And to me, it's the haystack problem. You've got really material quality, product quality errors hidden in the haystack somewhere. But what we see as we visit customers is, yes, they're working on those errors that they know about, but most of the errors that they know about, especially in the review and release time, they're doing Pareto analysis on how many fields were illegibly written and how many fields were not filled in. They're spending so much time on product quality, which is just GDP errors that should go away if you just digitize. So fewer errors, shorter reviews, better audit outcomes, reducing overall risk. To me, it's just the transition. One of the key reasons why do you switch from paper to digital? Get rid of all of the GDP errors and the quality and the focus that's being spent on the problem area that is not really your product quality area. It's your documentation area. Here's another customer that did before and after estimates. So, for example, in execution, they estimated, and actually they measured the number of hours that each operator spent documenting things in a paper-based batch record. And then they estimated what it would be once they went digital with an EBR. So they did that for hours the operator would spend, and then the hours that manufacturing did their dispo or their review, and then the hours that the QA review. So execution hours on a per operator basis, by going digital, they cut the number of hours, which arguably is non-value added time. Your operators are spending things not producing, they're spending time documenting. It went down by 50%. The manufacturing review, they estimated it would go from 1.75 hours to 0. It actually went to 1. And the reason for this, while it's still a 43% reduction, in their execution, they had some of their QC and other processes that were still paper-based. And so their manufacturing team still had to do some reviews of paper-based documents that hadn't been fully digitized as part of their core batch record. QA review, they estimated would go from 4 to 1. It did go to 1, and this was before employing or deploying review by exception. Just by reducing the total number of manual entries that had to be reviewed and improving the quality of the remaining entries, they were able to get a 75% reduction of QA review hours. This means they were able to do the following. Oops, one more slide before I get to that. This is a separate customer. It's a very busy chart, so I'll just explain at a high level the key takeaways. I gave the example of the cost savings or the time savings of an individual calculation, but if you take the number of calculations that a individual company does across all operators, all sites, all shifts, it can be a really big number. And in this case, this particular company on this one product was doing 832,000 calculations. So if you take that and do a minute saved, you can come up with the non-value added hours eliminated. And those numbers become really large. So if you apply it to all of the automations, like calculations, table calculations, time and date calculations, There's 42 million actions that save 15 million minutes and generated 252,000 non-value added hours eliminated. It's up to the customer to do something with those non-value added hours to make better improvements. And in most cases, what we see is customers increase their throughput, take the same number of people and just do more with them. And that's represented in this last slide. So year over year, this company evaluated how much throughput they had in a paper-based environment. And in 2022, this was paper-based. And then they switched to MX in a digital environment and increased their throughput year over year, 31%. That's an almost unbelievable number. And so the individual, go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, Brian. And that was without adding operators. It was with the same headcount.
Thank you for clarifying. Without adding operators, the main difference was they were paper and then they went to with MX. This was such a big difference that the individual was questioned and spent a lot of time going through the data to make sure that it was accurate. And then in 2024, I haven't had an update since late last year. 2024, they were still tracking and actually improved beyond 2023's results. And so this was, to me, the ultimate. This is why we digitize. Yes, we can save operationally, we can save in departmental areas, but as an organization, if I can increase my throughput, and this is one of those customers, this blue line, they thought that they could not get any more out of that site. And to expand, they were going to have to ramp up an entirely new site. Instead, they went digital, implemented MX, increased year over year throughput, 31%, had the same number of people, and did not have to invest in all of the expenses associated with ramping up a new site. Time for some Q&A.
Brian, you want to take some questions that came through on the chat?
You bet. I'm going to look over here, find some of those questions.
I got the first one for you. You talked a lot about results. How long does it actually take to get those results?
Very good question. Interestingly, I normally include a slide or two on that because it is such, historically, you would expect 12 to 18 months if you were implementing a legacy MES. And I've gone to conferences where they thought 18 months was really fast. Using MX, a SaaS-based system that is fully configurable and requires no programming, our target to go live is 120 days. And what that means, go live means customers complete their first batch record in 120 days. It's intentionally designed to get a quick win. We can't go in expecting a customer to invest and then not invest right now. If a customer decided to buy right now in a traditional system, they would not see any results, start getting any results until 2027. And that's just too far. With MX and 120 days, the customers that start their implementation today would get the results before the end of 2025. So really exciting. I could have a separate webinar just on that, but I'll leave it at that unless you want to add something else, Dan.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. And another question then, do you see similar or different results per industry?
Good questions. The results that I showed crossed industries, medical device, biologics, traditional pharma, oral solid dose, etc. I would say the results are comparable when we normalize in the percentage. So for example, in the medical device industry, we don't see release times that are in the months. We more often see release times that are in the weeks. But they are typically doing higher volume, so they're doing more lots or batch records than the traditional biologics company. But they still gain, as I mentioned on the release time, they are still able to reduce their reviews by 90%. The impact is just as great because they have so many more that they're executing over the same time period.
Oh, great point. Another question, how does one go about doing the ROA analysis?
Mm. So one, just ask us. We would love to do an ROA analysis. Um, Two, to add a little bit of color commentary, I could not do an ROA analysis. I could take a stab, but it would be very low quality. And the reason is I have not helped hundreds of customers with 500s or 1,000 batch records go from paper to digital. The secret sauce in the ROA is Dan, who Dan and colleagues at MasterControl who have done so many of these that they're able to look at a paper batch record and instinctively know what does a certain section translate to in a digital environment. Because as Dan highlighted, we're not going paper to digital, paper on glass. Certain sections, certain fields are just going to go away when we go to digital. So I would say eventually, I would love more and more of the industry to be able to look at a paper-based batch record and do an ROA analysis. In today's environment, I would say the best ROA evaluations are limited to those people, those individuals that have done the same thing hundreds of times, literally, and we're able to see those patterns.
Yeah, feel free to send them our way. The more the merrier. And if you want to keep them under 15,000 data entries, that would be much appreciated, but we'll take whatever you got.
Awesome.
Another question, what's been the biggest surprise?
Ooh, would you like to take that one?
Ooh,
Or at
across the whole journey, I would say early on, it was finding out that customers weren't really leveraging the review by exception, which really put us on this whole journey into doing our checkup processes and understanding what the customer roadblocks were to doing that and developing some best practices and moving into the thinking digitally environment and giving a lot of really changing the way that we A, do the integrations and B, how we interact with the customers. Yours might be different.
Mine's high level, similarly. Mine is more at the digital transformation level, and I'm still shocked at how many life science companies are still using paper-based batch records. I started my career in the 90s, last century, at IBM, and we helped companies replace paper-based processes. And to still be doing that now, the part I've been surprised at is we introduced a solution that solves this. And we have amazing people like Dan working on it, but we still have so many companies that have not gone digital. And so, one of the reasons we're doing this webinar and one of the reasons that we're helping try to share this type of information is to give more of those customers that are still using paper the ammunition, the evidence, the data, the case studies, the real world outcomes. So we're trying to get that to them so that they can share that with their executives. And ultimately, my personal passion, I've seen too many problems associated with paper that if we just go digital, those problems go away. Sure, there will be other problems, but there's a huge body of work that just can go away by going digital. And to me, how do we help the organization? How do we help the industry as a whole? How do we help us as consumers of life science products? How do we help everybody by having more customers go digital? That's been my surprise. And hopefully, this webinar has been helpful. If you have other questions, please reach out to us. There's only so much we can cram into 1 hour. And we would love to chat with you further about maybe challenges you're seeing as to why you haven't gone digital yet, and maybe benefits and other things, tools we could offer you. Anything else to add, Dan?
I think you wrapped it up perfectly.
Wonderful. Thank you for everybody for attending, and we look forward to hopefully speaking to you soon.